Before I start this video, this is just to say that tomorrow I'm on my travels back to London. Travelling from mountain resorts in Switzerland can be quite a complex operation, as those of you who have done it perhaps know, and I cannot absolutely guarantee that I will be able to do a programme for tomorrow. If not, please accept in anticipation my apologies. I'm not saying yet that there won't be a programme tomorrow. All I'm saying is that I can't guarantee that there will be one. Anyway, with that, let me now turn to the current situation around the world, but specifically and primarily in Ukraine. And I would say that the relative lull that has happened on the battlefronts in Ukraine since the middle of June is continuing. I say relative lull, though that is a very comparative term. In some respects, the fighting remains at an extremely high level of intensity. If you look at the casualty figures, the casualty figures for Ukraine, the figures for Ukrainian losses that the Russian Defense Ministry is claiming, they continue to be extraordinarily high. There have been days when the Russian Defense Ministry has claimed that around 500 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed or wounded in any particular day, and sometimes the figures are higher than that. Now, I would reiterate again that at a meeting in the Kremlin about a week ago, 10 days ago, Sergei Shoigu, the Russian Defense Minister, told us that the Russian Defense Ministry gets its information about Ukrainian casualty figures from intercepts of reports to their higher commanders by Ukrainian officers who regularly, routinely give reports about their casualty numbers. And the Russians have been able to break whatever codes Ukraine has to try to scramble these sort of reports. The Russians apparently are able to unscramble them, and that supposedly gives the Russians a good insight into the overall casualties that Ukraine is suffering. At least that is what Shoigu told us. Now, I'm not able to confirm what Shoigu said. It may be that what he said is a piece of misinformation. It might be intended to deceive or confuse the Ukrainians. But then, of course, if the casualty figures that Shoigu is giving us are wrong, then the Ukrainians would know that their communications are not being intercepted, and presumably they would not be deceived. They would simply know that Shoigu is in fact making this whole thing up. So that makes it perhaps a little unlikely that Shoigu is just making it up. But let me repeat again, this is what he says. I cannot vouch for the truth of it, but for what it's worth, the figures overall do look reliable. And as I've said in the past, even if they're not fully reliable and should not be entirely accepted, they do give a fairly good insight into the level and intensity of the fighting on the battlefields. And it continues, as I said, to be at a high level, certainly higher than it was, for example, at the end of last year. There's definitely been a significant increase in casualty rates since the start of this year. Ukrainian casualty rates that the Russians are claiming. But of course, the exact number is something that only the Ukrainians themselves know. And in any event, that's not the point that I'm making. The fact that these casualty rates do look higher, it does suggest a higher level of intensity of the fighting than most of what we saw last year. Having said that, it's clear that, for the moment at least, Ukraine is not launching any big offensive attacks along the Zaporozhzhye lines. And from what I've been able to see, it also seems that the fighting in and around the Bakhmut area might also have declined somewhat. There was apparently a big Ukrainian attack towards the village of Kurdyumivka, which is to the south of Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut. It's a village captured by the Wagner Group as part of its assault on Bakhmut in November of last year. It was captured following very heavy fighting. The Ukrainians seem to be making attempts to recapture it. Apparently it is a village with large numbers of factory structures. It was in part of the Bakhmut industrial area, if you like. So it was heavily fortified by Ukraine, and it's possible that some of these fortifications have been taken over by the Russians. About a couple of days ago, a Ukrainian infantry group approached Kurdyumivka, planted a flag on a dam near the village, and this is not in the village itself. And yesterday there were reports of a big Ukrainian attack on Kurdyumivka, an attempt to capture the village. The Russians say it was repelled, and the Russians also claim that 40 vehicles of the Ukrainian military army were destroyed in this attack. Now that is correct. That is a very large number of vehicles indeed. It suggests a big attack, and it would suggest that the attack was a complete failure. But as always, I cannot confirm these figures. I would say, however, that when the Russians made claims of very heavy losses by the Ukrainian forces in their attack south of Orechov on the 8th of June, there was some skepticism, including from myself, about whether the numbers of vehicles that the Russians claimed that they had destroyed could be true. But gradually, as photographic evidence has appeared, as film evidence has appeared, even magazines like Forbes in the United States are effectively admitting that this was indeed, these claims of huge losses by Ukraine on the 8th of June south of Orechov were true. In fact, if anything, I'm starting to get the sense that the Russian Defense Ministry might have even understated the level of losses that Ukraine might have suffered on that particular day. Well, it could be that just as the Russians were telling the truth about that attack south of Orechov on the 8th of June, they're saying the same. They're being equally accurate about the failure of this Ukrainian attack on Kurdyumivka, which took place yesterday, and these 40 armoured vehicles that 40 vehicles that the Ukrainians lost in this attack, that this is also an accurate number. Anyway, there's also been very heavy fighting in the area of the Antonovsky Bridge. The Ukrainians sent a landing party either to an island or to a small strip of ground close to the bridge on the east bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region. As I've said on several occasions, the fighting near the Antonovsky Bridge, the reports which come exclusively from the Russians, the Ukrainians have never discussed this fighting in any detail. Anyway, the reports have been extremely confused, with the Russians, in my opinion, obviously embarrassed that the Ukrainians were able to embed themselves for a time on the east bank of the Dnieper. Anyway, there was infantry attacks by the Russians to drive out these Ukrainian troops. The Russians admit that they suffered casualties because they were shelled by the Ukrainian artillery on the right bank of the Dnieper River. Then the Russians engaged in heavy counter-battery work against this Ukrainian artillery on the right bank of the river. They also launched attacks, bomb attacks with guided bombs, 1,500 kilo bombs on the Antonovsky Bridge, beneath which the Ukrainians were sheltering. And this proved to have only partial effectiveness. And then about 2 days ago, the Russians launched a missile strike upon this part of the bridge with an Iskander missile. There's lots of satellite pictures now of the explosion. The part of the bridge that we're talking about, the one that the Ukrainians were sheltering under, was finally completely destroyed. That seems to have deprived the Ukrainians of shelter. And the very latest reports is that the Russians are now systematically clearing the Ukrainian troops from whatever landing zone they established for themselves on the East Bank near the Antonovsky Bridge. And there's also been a report by the Russian commentator, or I should say perhaps pro-Russian commentator, Yuri Podolyaka. I believe he actually comes originally from Ukraine. Anyway, Yuri Podolyaka says that the Ukrainians are now trying to evacuate whatever is left of their landing party on the East Bank back to the Ukrainian-held West Bank. So it does look as if this particular episode, which has gone on for about a week, is now over. Now, I should say that there is some speculation that, again, the Russians allowed this group of Ukrainian soldiers to establish themselves on the East Bank as part of that general attrition strategy, and that basically they waited until this grouping had grown from the original 50 men to perhaps several hundred, and it was only then that they launched this big attack which managed to destroy this grouping. Now, I'm going to express skepticism about this. My own impression, on the contrary, is that the Russians have been embarrassed and vexed by this episode. And I also have to say that the fact that the Russians have had to use 1,500 kilo guided bombs and an Iskander ballistic missile to resolve this situation, it doesn't look to me as this is the kind of thing you would do if you were confident that you had the situation fully under control, and as if this was part of some sort of attrition battle. And I think, on the contrary, as I said, the Russians were embarrassed by this affair, and because they were embarrassed, that is the reason why we've had rather muddled reports about what exactly has been going on. But anyway, one way or the other, it does look as if this particular incident has now come to an end. Now, there's been other sporadic Ukrainian attacks along the southern front lines towards Piatikhatki, again south of Orechov, in other places. The Ukrainians have reverted to their old tactic of sending forward light infantry under artillery cover. They don't seem to be relying so much anymore on these armoured fists that they'd apparently experimented with on the urging of their Western advisors at the start of the offensive. But though the light infantry is perhaps better able to navigate the minefields than the armoured vehicles could, they are heavily exposed to shell fire from the Russian guns, and of course machine gun fire from the Russian infantry holding their positions. And again, one gets the sense that the casualties have been extremely high. But in any event, the attacks appear to be on relatively small scale, platoon and company level. So we're talking about 50 to 150 men in any particular attack, not at multiples of battalion levels, brigade levels, which is what we saw at the beginning of the offensive at the start of June. So it all does look as if things have quietened down and that we still have a lull. And in the meantime, further to the north, around Kupiansk, in the forests near Kremenaya, it does appear as if it is the Russians who continue to hold the initiative and are slowly, incrementally advancing. Though importantly, they're much more careful to advance in, as I said, a gradual and incremental way, as opposed to the approach that the Ukrainians have been taking. And by the way, I've seen some rather interesting reports, which I'm not going to try and assess myself, lacking as I do the expertise to assess them. But I have been seeing some reports now starting to appear in the United States, in the American military media, about the fact that the recent events have demonstrated that offensive war, as it was formerly understood, the kind of, well, let's call it blitzkrieg strategies allegedly invented by the Germans and applied by them in the 1940s, as if that style of war has finally come to an end. It seems that that when two peer armies are matched against each other, peer armies in terms of size, technological sophistication, abilities, command and control abilities, all of that, the kind of big arrow offensives that we all remember or think we remember from the Second World War have now run their course, and that it is no longer really possible to conduct offensives in that way any longer. Well, I'm going to say that I think this should be qualified. I think that clearly attrition is the kind of tactic that is now increasingly going to be used in war between peer opponents. Of course, it's important to stress that not all armies that face off against each other are necessarily at an equal technological or industrial level. And when an advanced army meets a less advanced army, then of course perhaps rapid offensives become much easier. As we saw, for example, in the 2008 fighting in Georgia, when the Russian army was able to wrap the whole thing up within about 3 days. So it may not be that this is a hard and fast rule in terms of all wars, and it also could be the case that once attrition has taken its course, then of course faster offensives begin to become possible. And personally, I would tend to agree here with Larry Johnson that this is probably the objective that the Russians are ultimately aiming for, that once they have bled the Ukrainian military dry, finally exhausted the West's ability to keep equipping Ukraine with new weapons, once the Russians have also successfully exhausted whatever political support for Ukraine exists in the West, then the Russians might be in a better position to launch more ambitious offensives than they have been launching since the real start of the war, which, in my opinion, began in April 2022, rather than in February 2022, when Putin launched the special military operation. Now that brings me to a rather interesting email that I have received from my source, my invaluable source, who has provided me with so much information about the Wagner organization, which I've discussed in the past, and which, it seems to me, has been fully vindicated by the information that has come to light as a result of the Prigozhin affair. And this source has told me quite openly and straightforwardly that since the Prigozhin affair, his contacts within the Wagner group have gone silent, something I do not find surprising at all. In fact, I am sure that they are now under strong instructions not to communicate with any outsider, anyone outside the Wagner organization. So I think it is entirely consistent and plausible that these people are not talking at the moment, at least not until this whole situation with the Wagner organization is fully and comprehensively sorted out. But this source does tell me that he has in fact managed instead to communicate with someone who has some level of access to more senior thinking within the Russian political and military system. Now, I do not know who this person, that this source has been in contact with, and you have to take all of this, therefore, with some degree of caution, because, the source itself, I found him consistently reliable up to this point, but I don't know about the person, as I said, that he is now in contact with. My feeling is that if this person exists, which, by the way, I believe it does, as I said, I found the source himself to be reliable, so I don't see why he should not be reliable about this new contact or this other contact. But anyway, my feeling is that if this individual does exist, which, as I said, I think he probably does, I think this ultimate source is probably a relatively senior Russian military officer. Anyway, that's my guess, and I want to stress this is not what the source has told me, just as I am careful not to say too much about the source, my source. He is very careful not to tell me too much about his own sources. So please take all of this with caution. But this source, the information he's giving is as follows. Firstly, he says that Putin himself prioritizes the economy and political stability. He has long since essentially left military decisions to the senior military. So it is Shoigu and Gerasimov and probably Surovikin, who I, by the way, still believe to be alive and well and in charge of the actual fighting on the battlefronts. I still feel that all these attempts to pretend that he's been arrested, detained, interrogated, or is in some kind of disgrace are all wrong. I'm sure that if any of that had happened, we would have a lot more information about that by this time. But anyway, let's put that aside. Anyway, it is the military who are making decisions about military matters. Right at the start of the conflict in February and March, when the Russians were pursuing a two-track policy, sending their military into Ukraine, but at the same time trying to push Ukraine towards negotiations, then I think Putin was extremely heavily involved. But since then, I think he has left the military alone to run things on the battlefronts. He is concerned with the economy. He's playing a significant role in supervising military production, defense production. This has been left mainly to Medvedev to do, but no doubt Putin does play a supervisory role. But his principal concerns are political, diplomatic, and economic. He's not, by the way, a military man either, and I think very sensibly he's leaving it to the military to conduct the conflict. Now, this source also says that the Russians are determined to see this thing through, however long it takes. Even if it takes years, they will continue with the war because they feel that they have absolutely no choice but to do so. That for Russia, this is a case of Russia having been put with its back to the wall by the United States, by the constant expansion of NATO eastward, that this is now becoming a huge danger for Russia, that the military and the political and economic establishments in Russia are all united about this, that there should be no doubt about resolve in seeing this through, and that they will see it through. And then this source has said what I think are the two most interesting things. Now, one, I think I personally would confirm myself. He said that one of the events that precipitated the decision to launch the special military operation in February is that for several months previously, the United States had been pouring Javelin and Stinger missiles into Ukraine. And this has increasingly been seen by the Russians as a sign that the United States was essentially preparing Ukraine for a war against Russia, and the Russians saw this as a threat. Are also becoming concerned, the Russians were also becoming concerned that the United States was providing radar kits and other surveillance equipment to Ukraine. And this was also something that apparently was underway for many months before the fighting began, and which, I'm not given a timeline, but may have started shortly after the Biden administration took office. And exact figures for the numbers of Javelin and Stinger missiles have been provided by this particular source. I'm not going to provide those figures, and besides, I'm not 100% confident that those figures would even be accurate. But I'm going to say this: I have long since come myself to the view that these Javelin and Stinger deliveries certainly began before the 24th of February. Ukrainian soldiers were equipped with thousands of Javelin and Stinger missiles already in March 2022. And notwithstanding that these are complex and difficult weapons apparently to operate, they were showing a fair degree of proficiency in their use. And that can only have been the case if those weapons had already been delivered before the fighting began. In other words, they were already being delivered before the fighting in February, both in the numbers to make them visible to the extent that they were visible in March 2022, and in the numbers, and in order for the Ukrainians to achieve the kind of proficiency in their use that they showed over the course of the March fighting. So it looks to me as if, given how apparently difficult javelins are, especially to use properly, that the deliveries must have begun at least 6 months before the fighting started, which would put deliveries at some point in the summer of 2021, which is an interesting time. It would be around the time or shortly after the Geneva summit between Biden and Putin, which was, of course, a summit which many people, including myself, by the way, thought might actually lead to an improvement in US-Russian relations. So anyway, that's just one thing to say. And then there is a third piece of information that this particular source is coming up with. And here I'm going to be particularly careful and would once again underline the point that this is unconfirmed. But this particular source says that the Russians were indeed becoming seriously concerned about Ukraine launching some kind of nuclear weapons program, and the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant might have been possibly at the center of this program. Now, I don't want to say more about this, too much about this, because, as I said, I'm not certain about the truth of any of this. But certainly it does seem as if both the Russians and the Ukrainians are very, very concerned about the fate of this nuclear power plant. The Ukrainians are telling everybody that the Russians are going to blow it up. The Russians clearly worry that Ukraine is going to launch some kind of attack to recapture it. Ukraine has, in fact, launched multiple attacks to recapture it. General Zaluzhny, in that interview with the Washington Post I spoke about yesterday, also said that the fact that there were dangers of an explosion at the Zaporozhzhye nuclear power plant carried out by the Russians would not affect any decisions he made for its recapture in the slightest. It's possible that this information might explain some of the reasons why this plant is seen as so important by both sides. Anyway, for the record, there continues to be an enormous amount of talk in Ukraine about the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, about the Russians detonating some kind of a device to blow this nuclear power plant up to create massive contamination. Ukraine continues to undertake drills in preparation for that, and the Russians, for their part, continue to speak about Ukrainian plans to try to recapture this nuclear power plant. The situation around the nuclear power plant remains as tense as always, and frankly, in terms of the conflict or the potential direction of the conflict, it is, in my opinion, the single biggest point of concern. Now, Belitsky, who is the Russian appointed governor of the Russian-controlled areas of Zaporozhye region, he has said that the plant is very heavily defended and that there is no possibility of Ukraine being able to recapture it. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, who have had inspectors at the power plant and who've carried out regular inspections of the power plant, they say that they have seen no evidence that the Russians have mined the nuclear power plant, the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and that they are looking to blow it up. And interestingly, the Pentagon seems to be saying the same. They too say that they have seen no evidence up to now of any Russian plan to destroy the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. So, given that this is so, I'm going to go along with all of that. I see no reason to doubt what the IAEA and the Pentagon are saying on this. I too think that these reports by Ukraine of a Russian plan to blow up the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant are most likely, almost certainly, highly probably false. Now that, however, begs the question of what exactly it is that Ukraine is thinking of doing with the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Are they going to try and launch some kind of attack to blow it up themselves? Now that might not be actually very easy to do. I've had and read some accounts of this power plant. It looks to be an absolutely massive structure. It's a completely different kind of nuclear power plant to the other nuclear power plant at Chernobyl, which caused all that accident back in 1986. There's no parallels or similarities between the two. So it might not be easy to cause or trigger some kind of explosion there. And Belitsky, as I said, says that it would not be possible for the Ukrainians to capture it either. Now, it could be, and that the Ukrainians are indeed planning some kind of event connected to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. But I think there is one other final possibility, which is perhaps not one that people are necessarily attracted to, in the sense that people are always more looking for big dramatic events. But it is possible that Ukraine is trying to increase international pressure on the Russians to hand over control of the nuclear power plant back to Ukraine. They've tried this before, and it could be that this is what they're trying to do. Now, I come back to what I said about the information given by the source. If the Russians believe, and it's a very big if, that the power plant did have some kind of a role in a Ukrainian nuclear nuclear weapons program, then the Russians are not going to surrender the power plant to Ukraine. I mean, that is inconceivable. And if, and let me repeat again, it is a huge if, the power plant did indeed have such a role in a possible Ukrainian nuclear weapons project, and if, which is an even bigger if, Ukraine might be interested at some point in reviving that project, then that might explain why Ukraine is so keen to regain control of it. But in that case, presumably, they would want the nuclear power plant back intact, which would argue against either a Ukrainian provocation, an attack on the power plant intended to destroy it, or alternatively, an attempt by Ukraine to try to recapture it. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about this, and I want to reiterate one last time that this is all based on a source who I have had no direct contact with. I'm in touch with a party who has been very reliable up to this point, but he says that he has this information. It may be true. I can't verify it myself. I don't have that information to hand, but anyway, I thought I would pass that on. You need to take it all, as I said, with extreme care. I can't establish the truth of this, but if it is true, it might explain, it might provide answers to some of the riddles about this nuclear power plant, which we have seen. Anyway, now that brings me to the other topic, which is Russian military production. There's been an article, which I think I saw on a Russian site, but I can't remember which one offhand. But anyway, there was a long article, which actually had a Bulgarian source, but was clearly based upon information from Russia, which spoke about a massive reorganization in terms of the Uralvagonzavod factory in Nizhny Tagil in the Urals, and about how this particular factory is now going to be dedicated exclusively to tank production. Now, Nizhny Tagil is a gigantic factory. In Soviet times, it was the Soviet Union's biggest tank factory. It was in fact, and still is, by a large measure, the biggest tank factory in the world. But it also produced various other types of heavy goods, rolling stock, heavy machinery, that kind of thing, that was intended for use by the civilian economy. And what apparently, according to this report, which by the way I think is reliable, what is now apparently in the process of happening is that Nizhny Tagil, Uralvagonzavod, is going to stop civilian production entirely and is going to revert exclusively to tank production, as it did during the Soviet era. And that doesn't mean that production of freight, rolling stock, heavy machinery, all that kind of thing, it is going to stop or is going to be dialed down. Uralvagonzavod is itself a part of a larger industrial grouping, all of which fall under the overall control of Russia's giant Rostec corporation. What it means instead is that Uralvagonzavod's former civilian output is now going to be reassigned to other large industrial plants, which in turn are going to stop military production, so that tank production and production of certain heavy vehicles for the military, self-propelled howitzers and that kind of thing, is going to be concentrated on Uralvagonzavod, simplifying industrial infrastructure and logistics, increasing economies of scale, and resulting in a very, very substantial increase in Russian tank production. And this is on top of the increases in tank production, which we have already seen. And the Bulgarian report said that the Russians are now reverting back to the old Soviet idea that their military needed thousands of tanks and millions of shells, and that the days of the Russians trying to run a pared-down military are over. We will probably not see a huge increase in the share of the military that in the share of the military that is the share of Russian GDP that is committed to the military. Apparently it will stay at around 3%, but this very significant industrial reorganization, which is now underway, will enable Russia to further increase military production, and that this is now not just for this existing conflict in Ukraine, but it is something that is now permanent, that it is now something that will continue indefinitely. And that, I think, is going to have important implications for the future. Be interesting to see how the West responds. There's already some talk that Rheinmetall will try to set up a secondary production line to increase its production of tanks. But to be very clear, Rheinmetall is in no condition to match Russian production figures for tanks, ammunition, any type of military equipment. And given the gathering economic crisis in Europe, finding the funds to do that anyway would probably be all but impossible. The interesting question is how the United States is going to respond to this, what the United States is going to do, all the more so as it faces an increasing military industrial challenge from China, whose industrial resources are, of course, greater than those of the United States itself. Anyway, that's the information about the conflict that I can provide today in this program. There is one other topic that I want to discuss. The Ukrainians have been very upset by the leak of the visit to Kiev by William Burns, the CIA director. The fact that apparently Burns broached with the Ukrainians the issue of negotiations with Russia. I suspect they're equally alarmed by the fact that William Burns has now had a telephone conversation with his opposite number in Moscow, Sergei Narishkin, who heads the Russian intelligence service. And we've had a number of statements, extremely belligerent statements from Ukraine. President Zelensky has said that Ukraine will only enter into negotiations with the Russians if every single millimeter of Ukrainian territory occupied by the Russians, including Crimea, is returned to Ukrainian control. The Russians must withdraw from all of this territory, hand it back to Ukraine, and then, and only then, will Ukraine negotiate with the Russians. It's not clear what Zelensky thinks Ukraine would have, what the purpose of such negotiations in that case would be. In my opinion, it's a straightforward statement by Zelensky made over the course of a press conference with the Spanish Prime Minister, Mr. Sanchez, in Kiev. It seems to be more intended to basically shut down the idea of negotiations than, in fact, in any way part of a genuine negotiation pitch. And Mikhailo Podolyak, one of Zelensky's aides, has also come out and flatly said that he Ukraine entirely rejects any idea of negotiations with the Russians. And Dmytro Kuleba, the Ukrainian foreign minister, has made a further statement in which he says that it's absolutely essential for Ukraine to be granted admission into NATO. If Ukraine is not granted admission into NATO, then that opens the way for further Russian advances into Europe, which could be seen, by the way, as Ukraine rejecting these alternative proposals for some kind of watered-down security guarantees to be offered to Ukraine as an alternative to NATO membership. Now, these very strong comments from Ukrainian officials, to my mind, look like a Ukrainian pushback against what I suspect is growing pressure from some quarters to get Ukraine to accept the realities, the battlefield realities. The offensive is not going well. It is at a standstill. Zelensky is now coming out making demands for more and more guns, more and more ammunition, fighter jets, ATACMS missiles. He may get some fighter jets, F-16s, but nobody expects that to change the overall battlefield situation. He may get some ATACMS missiles, but the same applies for those too. Shells, it's very difficult to see where he's going to get them. US production of shells, and it's become absolutely clear that it is only the United States which is in a position to produce shells in anything like the kind of quantities that would make any kind of difference in the fighting on Ukraine's behalf. The United States is maxed out in terms of production of shells. It would be years before US shell production were increased to the point of matching current levels of Ukrainian expenditure of shells, and all the indications are that the United States, for all kinds of reasons, capacity reasons, is not going to be able to match Russian shell production in any foreseeable period, unless, of course, it were to undertake a massive reorganization of its entire military economy, which, is possible, but even that would take time. So, we can see the pressures that are now starting to build. There's clearly talk to Ukraine. You must start discussions. You must begin negotiations. You must accept the realities. Ukraine, for its part, very unwilling to make those kind of concessions, holding out for more weapons, more supplies, more provisions from the West. And this, I'm afraid, is where I end my program today. As I said, we'll see how the push-pull between Ukraine and its allies plays out in the next couple of weeks. We have the Vilnius summit, the NATO summit, right round the corner. Some people in Russia seem to believe that a renewed Ukrainian offensive is just round the corner, well, we shall see. But one way or the other, for the moment, the talk is swinging back towards negotiations, but Ukraine is not prepared to agree. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. And let me remind you again, you can find all of our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. And last but not least, you don't forget our shop, and don't forget to check your subscription to this channel and to press the like button if you've liked this video. That's me for today. Thank you again. More from me soon, and have a very good day.